The argument over whether the UK should return the Elgin Marbles to Greece broke out again last month after Rishi Sunak accused the Greek Prime Minister of trying to grandstand over the Parthenon sculptures. Sunak defended cancelling a meeting with the Greek PM and said it had become clear the meeting was not to discuss substantive issues for the future. Well, will there ever be an end to this dispute? I'm delighted to be joined by writer and author Tiffany Jenkins. Welcome to the show, Tiffany.
Thank you.
Now, Tiffany has written this fantastic book, and I read this recently, and I would urge everyone to read it. This is called Keeping Their Marbles. But it's a book that's not just about the Elgin Marbles. You also cover all sorts of other aspects of repatriation for museums. But let's just start with the Elgin Marbles. Elgin took these, brought them. They are now in the British Museum. They've been there ever since. What's the background to this? Why? Because it was always controversial, wasn't it?
The Acropolis itself and the Parthenon was controversial when it was first built by Pericles in 432 BC.
Oh, so this goes way back.
It's like a really, it's a long history to it. I mean, it was controversial at the time because it was a very flamboyant and expensive project.
Yes. And
it would have been a kind of knockback to the Persians, who they just had a war with. It was a sort of trophy after a war.
Yes.
Come the 19th century, Greece wasn't a state at that stage. It was under the Ottoman Empire. So many travellers hadn't been able to get there. The Turks were having wars with Venice. But finally, sort of come the 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, you have a kind of opening up. And you also have a particular moment where people began to get interested in antiquity. Up until that point, they weren't really that interested. You know, when the British Museum was first opened, it was full of objects and artefacts from the voyages of discovery. There was no antiquity in there. At that very moment, it was also used as a garrison by the Turks, and there was a mosque in there.
In the Parthenon?
In the Parthenon.
Yeah.
It was ruined.
Yes.
I mean, it was just a ruin. People were taking bricks and parts of it for their houses and grinding it up and all the rest of it.
Yes.
So it's not what we recognise today as this sort of an archaeological site.
That's very interesting, because you mentioned in the book, and I didn't know before reading your book, that even at the time Lord Elgin wasn't sure about taking the marbles, but he decided to do so to preserve them. He felt they were actually in danger if they remained in Athens.
They were in danger, and the French were also eyeing them up, as were the Germans.
Yes.
So he may have kind of... it may have been for sort of self-aggrandizement. It was originally for his home.
Yes.
But then it kind of... They just became overcome by the beauty of it, and they started taking it not just sort of drawings and casts. They did take a few from the building. And
one of the things you trace in your book is the impact of the Parthenon marbles in London on the artistic community, you know, on the very idea of aesthetics. You know, it's very, very important that they were there, I suppose, and they did preserve them.
They definitely preserved them. I think the interesting thing about when they arrived in London, and they were initially at his home in Park Lane, is that people rowed about what they were actually like, because they had this idea of what they were like. But when they actually saw the real things, in a way they were disappointed.
Oh, really?
Yes, because they had you know those Roman sculptures that they've got all their arms, they're really poised, they're really white, and then these battered Greek sculptures with half an arm kind of left on the floor somewhere. They're much more dynamic and vibrant as sculptures.
Yes.
So there's a big row over them as to whether they're any good or not. There was a discussion about actually restoring them and sanding them down and all the rest of it.
Yes, didn't they clean them in a very bad way?
That was the 1930s.
Oh,
that was later. So, but come this moment, you have this shift. You have this shift in taste away from Rome, which all the collectors are obsessed with, towards ancient Athens, and this sort of much more romantic feeling.
Now, Byron felt it was vandalism to take these.
He did, and there was that sort of, in keeping with that kind of romantic ideal, there was a sense that actually they should be just allowed to crumble further. Byron didn't want them to go into the Acropolis Museum or anything like that, which obviously didn't exist. He wanted them to just decay.
Right, OK.
Eroded by time.
So this dispute has been going on a long time. There have been arguments from the very moment that Elgin brought them back, and we're still rowing about it today, and it's become a very politicised idea. Now, I have to say, I also read Christopher Hitchens' book on the Parthenon marbles, or the Elgin marbles. Even what you call them is contentious. And I have to say, I was persuaded. I was reading it and I was persuaded. I thought, OK, particularly aesthetically, I've been to the Acropolis Museum, I've seen the remaining marbles, and I did think to myself how wonderful it would be to have them all in one place with the view of the Parthenon, of the Acropolis over the way. That did persuade me. But then reading your book, and I was persuaded to your point of view, so I'm very undecided on this issue. So could you summarise, what is your argument for keeping the marbles in the UK?
I mean, I think it's reasonable to be persuaded either way, go back and forth. I was in Athens over the summer, and the museum, the Acropolis Museum, is elegant. And there you do see the Acropolis itself.
Yes.
And it makes sense of the Acropolis.
It does.
It also makes sense of that kind of particular moment of the Parthenon sculptures, because you see the sculptures that came before it, and they're really static and kind of stiff and almost like kind of robot dolls or something. And then the Parthenon sculptures come up and they're leaping around, and horses have pulsing veins on their long nose and all the rest of it. So you do get a particular sense of place and origin there. But in the British Museum, you get a different story that is complementary. I think you see it, if you walk into the British Museum, you kind of walk through the Egyptian galleries, the Persian galleries, you know, the Assyrians and the kind of enemy of Athens, and you see through comparison how distinctive the Parthenon
Absolutely,
is.
yes.
And so does it help us to better understand the Parthenon in the British Museum? Without question,
right.
It does, in a way that it can't at the Acropolis Museum, and vice versa. You know, so it's complementary.
But I suppose a lot of the debate has been reduced to this idea that museums are effectively driving imperialism. Now, you make the argument in your book that they benefited from imperialism, but they didn't drive it. Is it reductive to say that museums are effectively centres where we present the spoils of conquest, and that we should therefore send them back?
I think we have to look at what museums actually do, which is help us understand particular cultures and their particular moments through comparison. They take us out of our ordinary lives when we go in to see them and almost act like a time machine. You know, they can actually teach us a little bit about imperialism and colonialism.
Yes.
Although it has to be said, it was the Ottomans in the case of Greece.
Well, that's right.
Who were under, and obviously the Parthenon itself was built not just when Athens was at its most democratic, but its most imperial.
Yes,
you know,
and
the
Elgin
slaves sort of built it and all the rest of it. So
it's morally complicated.
It's morally complicated.
And didn't Elgin seek permission from the Ottomans?
Yes, and he got it. He got a firman. But, you know, permission today is very different when you have kind of contracts the size of an elephant.
Yes,
you know,
of course.
with everything dotted and all the rest.
So what do you make of this argument that, you know, because museums around the world are facing this reckoning at the moment? Do we return everything? Because do you feel that museums have become essentially politicised at the moment?
I think it's important to note that culture has always been political. When you had the vision that we have of the Acropolis today is a 19th century vision with the Bavarian monarchy seeking to show that the new Greek state was actually not just a kind of new invention. It went back centuries. Equally, when Britain acquired the marbles, there was a sense that it would restore some sort of democratic ideal within Britain. So there's politics around. But now, in a way, there's kind of, it's all instrument, and there's no understanding of ancient Athens. I mean, the interesting thing about this discussion recently with the Greek Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak was that it had absolutely nothing to do with the Parthenon. You learnt nothing. And I think we need to get back to a situation where actually museums can tell us about the past, not moralise or lecture us, which is what they're doing now, and which I don't think anybody really likes, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on.
But hasn't that argument been lost in a way? Because I can't go to a museum these days without being lectured by these little placards that appear by various artefacts or even artworks, just telling me how evil the artist was, you know.
Yes. And how wrong you are to look at it.
Exactly.
It's a very serious problem. It's something that's been in the making for probably about 40 years.
Yes.
I think what's really important to understand about the repatriation argument is that in many cases, those calling for repatriation most loudly and most passionately are actually Western curators.
Right.
They're not, activists or indigenous groups or whatever. It's sort of, there's this kind of, let's chuck them out of the door, which is one of the things that you're having at the moment with the Benin bronzes. So there's this sort of internal crisis
Yes.
They haven't been captured. It's come almost internally.
Are you suggesting that social justice activists like to speak on other people's behalf? Outrageous.
They certainly do. But my point is it's come from within. I don't think they've been captured. I think they've birthed it.
Yes.
I mean, in a way, they've created the activists from without.
Yes.
And there's a wonderful story about an anthropologist in America returning some human remains, which have also been subject to great controversy, to a tribe. And the person who's receiving them is interviewed, and he says, well, we didn't really want them, but it'd be rude not to, because this guy was so kind of enthusiastic. And so there's this sort of, that dynamic is very strong, profound. But I think the reassuring thing is, if you want a kind of my perspective on whether we should be optimistic or pessimistic, is that I think the majority of audiences do not like it. And the objects themselves still speak. So if you go to the Duveen galleries and look at the Elgin Marbles, they will still tell you something about Athens, 2,500 years ago, regardless of the social justice.
Absolutely right. Tiffany Jenkins, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Thank you.